Down with Webster superfan Mark Carney is finally unpacking his boxes after his win last week, but there were a few other subplots that you may have missed. J.D. Vance's best bud Jamil Javani big dogging Doug Ford.
This guy's a political genius because he beat Bonnie Crombie and Stephen Del Duca.
NDP leader Jagmeet Singh and Green Party leader Jonathan Pedno stepped down, all while Elizabeth May did her best Joni Mitchell impression covering Louis Armstrong for her supporters.
Life can be so sweet on the sunny side of the street.
But the biggest, and I mean biggest, story of the night was Pierre Poilievre losing his own riding of Carleton to hometown boy Bruce Fanjoy.
I had thousands and thousands of conversations with people in Carleton. I think that the people of Carleton were ready for change.
Poilievre had this riding on lock for nearly 2 decades. This was a riding he was not supposed to lose. And in the biggest upset in recent political history, recent retiree Bruce Fanjoy said, "I'll give it a shot," and dethroned the Conservative Party leader. And now, to keep his job, Poilievre will run in a by-election a long way from home in the bustling metropolis of Battle River, Crowfoot in central Alberta. How did Bruce do it? So, first of all, congrats on your win. Huge accomplishment. But now that the dust has settled a little bit, things must be getting kind of real for you. I know that you have a new MP orientation. What's that like? It seems to me like it would be like the first day of school.
Well, it's there's an onboarding process. I haven't been through it before, of course, so can't tell you exactly what it's like, but all the usual things. There's some paperwork to do. There's some equipment to get, offices to be identified. I still have to hire staff that will be with me through this process. I haven't been sworn in yet. That'll be coming soon. You said the dust settled. I would still say that there's still a little bit of dust, but we're getting there.
This was obviously a ton of work for you. I know you've been campaigning for 2 years. What made you want to run initially?
Well, I knew it was that we were facing a historic election, and it would be an election that would determine the direction of the country, whether we would go in a direction where we take care of one another as best we can, we grow the economy, but also care about things like the environment. We believe in science and believe in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, or we take a more harsher right turn that Pierre Poilievre represented. And of course, that was before I even knew that Donald Trump was going to be elected to a second term. And I think that when that happened, Canadians became quite a bit more focused on just how consequential this election was going to be. I couldn't find anyone else to do it, so I ultimately decided, well, someone has to do it. It may as well be me.
Right, and good for you. I mean, you're retired, is that correct, or you were retired?
I was retired.
Yeah, nice. I was at your rally a week before the election. I was at your office. We didn't get a chance to speak, but I did see that Catherine McKenna and Steve McKinnon were there. It seemed like the Liberal Party was throwing a lot of resources at your riding. And I remember thinking when I was there, oh my God, this actually has some momentum. This guy could actually win. Your party seemed convinced that you can win, but when did you know that it was a serious possibility? Because I could imagine 2 years ago, it was still a long shot in your own head.
I believed we could win from the beginning. I wouldn't take on a futile exercise. I believed we could win because I know people. I know a lot of people in Carleton, and Pierre does not represent people in Carleton that I know. And that was the experience that I was having, knocking on over 15,000 doors.
Wow.
There were headwinds that I was facing through 2024. I nonetheless felt that, first of all, this needed to be done. And if I did everything I could and was unsuccessful, I could have lived with that. But I had to show up. And I knew that if I did, others would join me.
If you could just sum up for me in your own words how you did it.
Well, I didn't put Pierre Poilievre on a pedestal. A lot of people on social media were trying to say that this is impossible. You're going to lose in a landslide, sacrificial lamb, all these things. But I knew that going into the election, Pierre Poilievre had the same number of votes as I did. And, we were tied at 0. And, he wasn't offering a positive vision for Canada. We're very proud of being Canadians here in Carleton. We're right part of the National Capital Region. Once people started to believe that this was possible, it grew and it grew and it grew. That plus hundreds upon hundreds of volunteers who were pouring their heart and soul into this endeavor.
And I've heard two sort of narratives emerge. It's one that you obviously worked very, very hard and you had a message that was very appealing to people. But there's also that Poilievre didn't give the riding enough attention. Which narrative is more true?
Well, both are true. Pierre Poilievre opened the door for my victory by taking the riding for granted. Nobody ever likes to be taken for granted. His policies were too extreme for a lot of folks. We offered a positive alternative that was present. We were listening all over the riding, and people had tired of the American-style negative politics that Pierre practices.
Ottawa's a big civil service town. The convoy was here. How much did those two topics actually come up when you were talking to your new constituents? So, for example, Poilievre famously bringing donuts to the convoy protesters, or him talking about slashing the public service. Was that something that was on your constituency?
Very much so. People in Carleton, keep in mind that Carleton is fully within the city of Ottawa. We did not forget how he encouraged and supported the occupation of Ottawa, and not just Ottawa, but blockades at border crossings across the country. It was a tremendous disruption to our community, but also to the local economy and the Canadian economy. We didn't forget that. With respect to public servants, it's perfectly reasonable that they felt threatened by his policies. People can see what Donald Trump is doing to the public service in the United States. Pierre is cut from the same cloth ideologically.
Did you ever want to quit? Realistically,
No,
did you ever wake
no.
up and you're like, I'm too tired to knock on doors today?
Well, when that occasionally happened, I just took a break that lasted a day. For me, it was a mission. I didn't want, I couldn't watch something happen to my country when I believed that I could do something about it. So that's a powerful motivator. My priority, first and foremost, is to Carleton. It's been a long time since they've had an MP that was present and actively listening to their concerns and working on their behalf. So I think Carleton deserves my full attention. And that's what they're going to get.
Speaking of absent MPs, what do you make of Poilievre's decision to run in Alberta?
It's Alberta's a long way from Carleton. Carleton spoke loud and clear. For someone who likes to brand himself as very careful with the public purse, he certainly doesn't avoid expenditures on himself. So we've just had an election in the riding that he wants to represent, and now we're going to have to do another one. That costs money. I hope that Mr. Poilievre will show some grace and be more of a cooperative figure in the House of Commons if and when he returns.
Have you spoken to him since your win?
No, I haven't. No.
And if you had any advice for him as a winning candidate, what would you say?
I don't think that he would be interested in any advice I would have to offer him. So I'm not sure I would waste either of our time.
Well, Mr. Fanjoy, I really appreciate this. Good luck in the next 4 years.
Okay, thank you very much, Sam.
So Bruce Fanjoy's win was obviously a huge surprise this election, but there were a few other surprises hidden in the election results that I missed. So to go over some of those surprises with me, I have David Coletto, the founder and CEO of Abacus Data. He's deep in the numbers, analyzing every tiny part of this historic election. Let's get into it. David, how's it going?
Great, Sam. Great to see you.
So maybe first off, how was the election for you? Was it tense?
Yeah, well, I mean, every election day is incredibly stressful because it's the one time that a pollster like me is held to account. We say things every day and you trust that what we are saying is true, but on election day, you actually can measure against it. And I am happy the polls did very well in sort of anticipating what was going to happen Monday night.
Was your polling correct? The $1 million question.
For the most part, it was. We had the Conservatives behind the Liberals by 2, but our regional numbers were really, really good. Like we were showing a tighter race in Ontario than a lot of the other pollsters. That materialized. They only won by about 4 points. Atlantic Canada, we were looking good. So yeah, I'm happy. I think we always have to keep in mind that these are tools that are not perfect. There's a margin of error for a reason. They are estimates. We were always showing this to be a much closer race than some of the others. The largest Liberal lead we had was days after, quote, Liberation Day in the United States, where we saw the Liberals grow to 6 points. But when the campaign started and all the other pollsters were showing a 5, 6, 7 point Liberal lead, we still had this race tied. And so and again, we're never going to know were the Liberals really 10 points ahead or were they tied? But we know where it ended, and it ended still as a pretty close race. I have no doubt we will look back at the 2025 federal election and talk about it for generations to come as one of those elections that was about something and likely will have a big influence and consequence on the direction of the country after.
So we spoke a little bit about what you did right. What didn't you get right?
We were off a little on the New Democrats. We were a little more bullish on the NDP. We had them at 10. They ended up just over 6%. Many of the pollsters, in fact, had them higher than they ended up being. So that was something that is a little bit of a head scratcher for me. I'm asking myself and my team, like, why could it, what was the cause of that?
But something that's really interesting to me is this phenomenon of a blue-orange voter. Who are these people that are switching from NDP to Conservative?
Great question. First of all, it's people who observe a lot of politics or even notionally, they think that, people live on a linear plane, that they go from like NDP to Liberal to Conservative, that there's this rational kind of left to right. Most people aren't like that. They don't see politics through a left-right spectrum. And so that New Democrat Conservative switcher typically lives in provinces where the NDP has been stronger. So think of the prairies, think of British Columbia, think of Northern Ontario, Southwestern Ontario, in terms of geography. They're typically working, they're unionized often, particularly private sector unions. And they don't like the Liberals, and they all agree on it because the Liberals kind of sometimes feel too corporate, a little bit too, I'm going to say, woke sometimes. And so these are very much economic voters, primarily male. A lot of them vote Conservative, but they believe in the power of a union. And so as the Labour Party, the NDP has historically had a connection with that universe. But these folks are also culturally conservative. They would also find it hard to connect with the more social identity politics side of the NDP. Right? They're talking about gender equity and trans rights. Those are things that they have a harder time being comfortable with. And so that's that orange-blue switcher. And I think Pierre Poilievre did very, very well with them in this election. Just under 69%
of Canadians voted. Were you expecting that?
My estimate was 70. So it was pretty close, right?
That's pretty close.
Yeah, it's a hard thing to measure with a survey because oftentimes people don't want to admit they're not going to vote if they don't intend to because there's a social desirability bias. Then we asked the question on our survey. We asked people on a scale of 0 to 10, how likely are you to vote? And what I've learned over doing many, many elections is that people who say 10 are actually going to be the people who vote. And if you say anything less than 10, you're probably not voting.
Do you have data yet on who showed up versus who didn't?
Elections Canada typically puts out an estimated turnout by age and gender, often a few months after the election. And that's as definitive a sense of that we'll likely get. I can hypothesize, if I'm going to use a kind of scientific term. And so what we knew from our survey is that if you were over the age of 60, for example, 85% of people said they were going to likely vote or already did at the time that election day came on Monday. If you were under the age of 30, that dropped to just over 45%. So that's a huge differentiator. And generation is often, or age is one of the biggest factors that is predicting your likelihood to come out and vote. And I think it was a factor here. And I think Trump was a big factor in that. Older folks, like my parents, were like enraged by Trump. And if you were under the age of 40, really, you don't read or consume or watch as much traditional news. So I think age was a big factor.
If you could break down for me in your polling how men voted versus how women voted, and maybe how young people versus old people voted in a party specific sense.
There was a consistent and persistent gender gap. So men were more likely to vote Conservative, women more likely to vote Liberal. Age was a factor, and in some ways a large factor. Throughout, we were seeing the Conservatives doing better among young Canadians. And I use young as like under 40-ish. But the most interesting story of this election, I think, or one of the most interesting, was what baby boomers did. And particularly baby boomer men. So if you take gender and you intersect it with age, that's where the story really starts to emerge. So if you're over 60, male or female, you were voting Liberal, and you were much less likely to vote Conservative than you did in the previous federal election. Hence, why you saw that ad of the two white golfers, talking about the election and the very end of the campaign.
You know what Mark Carney says.
Come on, do you really think that a fourth Liberal term is going to change anything?
I've been thinking the same thing.
Are we really going to give these clowns a fourth term? I'm voting Conservative. There you go.
Yeah, for a change.
It looked like a Viagra commercial.
Yeah, right? And so they couldn't imagine a more transparent ad telling us who is the target audience for that.
Yeah.
It was exactly those two men in that ad. Now, on the other side of the age spectrum, what we did see was a very large divergence between what young men thought about politics in Canada and said they were going to do, and what young women were doing. And there was some interesting reporting by a number of organizations on this throughout the campaign. Young men really moved towards the Conservatives, really liked Pierre Poilievre, and young women didn't vote Conservative at the same rate. It would be too simplistic to say young Canadians embrace the Conservatives, but because there was a more nuance to it.
I saw on the Abacus website that they had a student vote survey where they go into schools and talk to students about how they would vote, and they do sort of a fake election. What did you learn from that study?
Student Vote is this great program that's run every year where students in elementary and secondary school vote in mock elections at the same time that adults have the chance to vote. And for the first time in the close to 20 years that Student Vote has existed, the party that won the real election did not win the student election. In fact, the Conservatives won among youth. 38% of students voted for the Conservatives, the highest vote share they ever had. And so that generational story, I think, is a really important one, because we saw evidence throughout this campaign that young people were not thinking about the same issues, looking at their political choices in the same way as older ones.
What does that student vote tell you about the future of conservatism? Is that a good indicator of where the
it's a better indicator than if they got only 10%, right? Like, I think there's some narrative after this election about the durability of the Conservative coalition in the future. I think it does doesn't guarantee or predict, but it pretells potentially an upside for Conservatives long term, and one that Liberals should be worried about, that their voters are actually much older than they were when Justin Trudeau won in 2015.
Totally. The Conservative decade ahead is what I keep hearing.
Let me just say one thing on that, Sam. When Barack Obama won in 2008, they said it would be a Democratic majority for basically the next 20 years because of the demographics that voted for Obama in that election. And we know only 8 years later what happened in the U.S. So
Yeah.
Predicting the future is hard.
I want to take a quick tour through regional polling and regional election results. Is there anything that stuck out particularly to you this election that you weren't expecting? I'm thinking, for example, in Atlantic Canada, it looked like Sean Fraser was going to lose his seat for a little while.
Sean Fraser's riding was the incumbent. Right now, the Conservative, Bryce Jenkins, in the lead. And I will tell you, Conservatives I've spoken to have said Bryce Jenkins really hustling.
That was really surprising to me. So that's just one example. But is there certain parts of the country that surprised you?
Ontario was interesting to me. And it wasn't just the GTA. People talk about the Greater Toronto Area as one big group of 6 million people. But if you know the area and you even drive a few 10 kilometers one way or the other, you could be in a very different place with people from different backgrounds and experiences making up a vast majority of the people who live there. And I think that expressed itself this time. I think we saw areas with higher concentrations of South Asian or Chinese communities voting more conservative.
Mm-hmm. That was what was surprising to me, to see the Conservative take a little bit of a hold there.
Or in where I have a lot of family as an Italian, having Italian heritage, like Vaughan Woodbridge, overwhelmingly voted Conservative this time. And so that was an interesting story. The other thing that to me is indicative of a slight realignment that we've seen over the last, I would say 6 to 7 years is where ridings like Windsor, Ontario, where a lot of manufacturing happens, particularly auto manufacturing, for the first time, I think, in history, voted in a Conservative member of Parliament in both Windsor ridings. Part of it was due to the collapse of the New Democrats, but it was also due to, I think, folks who are in the trades or in manufacturing, who boots, not suits, as Poilievre tried to say. That worked. That really worked. And then lastly, I'll just talk briefly. I mean, BC is an enigma because it's really like 3 provinces in one, or 3 regions in one. But the Liberals won the popular vote in British Columbia, and it cemented. They lost seats in Ontario, but they gained seats in British Columbia. And again, that age factor, I think, was really at play. BC typically has a slightly older population because people often retire there. The weather's better. And a city like Victoria or Kelowna are in particular destinations for retirees. And Victoria safely went Liberal, which had been an NDP seat for a very long time.
Victoria, the capital city, going to the Liberals for the first time since 2008.
And Kelowna barely went Liberal. So interesting dynamics across the country. Last thing I'll say is the supposed breakout of Liberals in the prairies, particularly in Saskatchewan and Alberta, did not materialize. The Liberals lost their 1 seat in Calgary. They gained 1 more. And so they're left with very little representation in Saskatchewan and Alberta. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but there's a very unique political culture in Alberta and very unique identity that I think drives political behavior there.
That's actually a good transition into my next question. You said that the Liberal vote was more cost effective, especially in Ontario, Quebec, and Atlantic Canada. What does that mean?
Let me put it this way. There are many seats in this country where the Conservative candidate was getting 60, 70, 80% of the vote. There were far fewer of them that the Liberals were. And so the way to think about it, and it's not to say there's any truly wasted votes, but from a political strategy perspective, winning 80% of the vote in Alberta gets you still 1 seat. But if you're able to win 45% of the vote in most of the ridings in the Greater Toronto Area, that's going to get you a lot more seats. And so the Liberal vote is more distributed evenly across the country, and particularly in high population areas. So think Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal. And they did in the previous 2 elections, where they actually got fewer votes than the Conservatives, but won substantially more seats because their voters were more distributed. And the Conservative vote was way more concentrated in rural, Western parts of the country.
You talked about the popular vote a little bit back there. Obviously, getting rid of the first past the post system is something that's been on the table for a long time. How would this election have looked if it were done by proportional representation?
So let me say something that's going to drive proportional representation advocates nuts. This was a very proportional outcome, right? But it was also a very binary election. The Conservatives got 41% of the vote, and they're going to get about 41% of the seats. But it depends how you would design a system. That if you actually went and did regional or provincial level proportional breakouts, then you should have more Albertan Liberal MPs than you actually have, right? And you should have more Conservative MPs in Quebec than you have. So in a weird way, the nature of this election didn't allow our electoral system to distort the results as much as it usually does.
Biggest surprise this election?
The biggest surprise for me is that the Liberals won a fourth term, because I was saying to absolutely everyone in December, just 4 months ago, that Poilievre's inevitable, and unless something fundamentally changes, he will win. Something fundamentally changed.
Thank you very much, David. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Sam.
All right, that has been This Week in Canadian Politics. I will see you next week. Let us know what you're pissed off about, what you're watching closely, and what you want to hear about on this show. You can email me directly at sam@canadaland.com, and I do read what you send me, so please send those emails along. This episode was written and produced and fact-checked by Aviva Lessard, Noor, Azrieh, and me, Sam Konnert. Our mixing and mastering is by the very talented Thompson. Max Collins is our director of audio, and Jesse Brown is the boss as Canadaland's editor and publisher. Our theme music is by Nathan Burley. If you value this podcast, support us. You will get premium access to all of our shows ad-free, including early releases and bonus content. But more than anything, you will be part of the solution to Canada's journalism crisis. You'll be keeping our work free and accessible to everybody. Thank you for listening.